Okay, good morning, and I'm glad that you all can make it. And I just want to make sure that everyone is doing okay. Being quarantined in your houses, or very little contact, or very little social distancing. Let's make sure that we continue to do all the things necessary so we can get back to doing this live. All right, so we can get back into the schools. When that's going to be, I really don't know. But we'll figure it out as we go. I have never like this before, just like you, and we're just going to make the best of it. All right. So with that, let's get going. So today we're going to deal with the Communist Revolution in China. And the one thing that we have to keep in mind with the Communist Revolution in China is that we got to remember our context here. And you have to keep in mind, what was it about the Qing dynasty that forced people to really consider communism? And then when we think about it, what was the one problem, or what were several problems that the Chinese were facing when, Mao was growing up? And this is what the world of China looked like at the time. We've seen these maps and we've seen this political cartoon before. Remember, this was at the time of huge imperial or huge European influence on China. And they were carving out spheres of influence: the British, the French, the Russians, and then, of course, as we see in the little cartoon here, we have the Japanese. They're all going into China, carving them up, looking for resources. This is the age of imperialism. Okay, remember, and China also tried to fight back a little bit here with the movement. They said, let's get rid of all European influences. That didn't quite work out well for them. You have the Taiping Rebellion going on. You have the Boxer Rebellion going on. And, after the Boxer Rebellion, the Europeans came in much stronger than before. And millions of people are dying in China. You have famine. So that is the context of the time period that Mao was growing up in. And he was trying to, come up with better and new ideas to, force his country, or to help his country. All right. So let's take a look at the end of, or right at the end of the 19th, early 20th century. All right. So we have the collapse of the imperial system in China. And basically what that means is the last dynasty went away in about 1911. That is when the Qing dynasty basically went into the past. And then by 1912, we have this guy by the name of Sun Yat-sen lead the Nationalist Party. He wanted to be this strong democratic China, like we had seen, in other places like, the United States, a strong democratic country. Well, the problem during this time period under Sun Yat-sen, you have a lot of factionalism going on. China is fractioned, all right? It's fractured. As you see by the map here in 1924, you see different warlords taking different areas of China. Like this guy here on our left is Yuan Shikai. He was a warlord. He controlled a certain area of China, and of course, that was not in the control of Sun Yat-sen and his Nationalist Party. Also, the Versailles Peace Conference didn't treat China very well. All right, it allowed Japan to keep the land seized in China. It upset the educated Chinese. They looked for other philosophies to help China. The National Party of Sun Yat-sen admired Lenin's tactics. They called in a Soviet advisor. So early on, Sun Yat-sen was looking at early, communism, even though communism was not what he wanted in his country. All right. Also, during this time period, you have what is called the May 4th movement. It is this anti-imperialist movement. It's a response to the Treaty of Versailles. It's very pro-Chinese. It's very pro-Chinese culture. Lots of politics. It is a large student movement. So you see a a backlash to the Versailles Treaty. You see kind of a backlash going on to this nationalist type of government because the kids, the politicians, the educated are not seeing a huge movement to help them in any way. All right, so in this time period, we have the weaknesses of the Republic of China. First of all, it's very unorganized, a lot of disunity going on. As I had said before, local warlords are fighting the Kuomintang for control. So you have lots of wars raging between 1912 and 1928. You still have foreign imperialists. You have the Americans, you have the Europeans, you have the Japanese, still trying to influence China in a lot of ways. Maybe not so much politically, but very much so economically. You have poor transportation. In 1914, right at the beginning of World War I, only 6,000 miles of railroad track are laid in China compared to 225,000 miles in the United States, which was a much smaller area. And then, of course, you have few decent roads. So transportation across the country, being able to move from one place to another, isn't very conducive to helping an empire or helping a country gain stability. All right, let's take a look at the Nationalist Party. What did they want? This is Chiang Kai-shek here. He promoted modern development. He looked at railroads, banking, airline services, things of that nature to try to get his party in stable control of the country. The problem? Lack of support from the majority of the population. Remember, in China, like in most countries of the time, most of the population was rural. You know, they lived on farms. They weren't large city dwellers by any means. The nationalists in Chiang Kai-shek were only supported by the urban elites, those who had money in the cities, landlords, Western powers, people like that. The peasants, the common man, the farmer did not support the Nationalist Party because they didn't think their ideals matched at all. And then you have the CCP. CCP basically stands for Chinese Communist Party. That is what that's what it stands for, and I will refer to the CCP. So if I do refer to the CCP, it's just the Chinese Communist Party. They develop in opposition to the Nationalist Party. They gained support of the masses because of some things. That land reform. They wanted to return the land back to the farmers, back to the peasants. And Mao Zedong here, he is going to be the future leader of the Chinese Communist Party and the future leader of China. He was a pig farmer himself. He was a peasant. So he knew of their problems, and that's what gains him a lot of support. He also supported women's rights in China at the time. Education, because they knew in order for them to move forward, in order for them to advance, education was key to their country. So here are some the Chinese political opponents. This is what it looked like in 1945. And I think this is just a really great chart here to kind of show you the differences between these two main parties in China in 1945. Chiang Kai-shek, Mao Zedong, they are your leaders. The areas that they ruled, for the most part, the nationalists were in southern China and the communists were in northern China. Where did they get their foreign support from? Of course, it's 1945. We've already talked about this in the Cold War lecture. The United States supports that idea of democracy, and the Soviet Union supports that idea of communism. So that's where Mao gets most of his support from very early on. Domestic policy, the nationalists, all they wanted to do was defeat the communists. That was their main goal. And then Mao wanted national liberation. No support from the outside, no influence from the outside is what he is looking for. He's looking to build China up from within, with some monetary support from the Soviet Union, of course, but eventually that is going to go away as well. Public support, the Nationalists didn't get a whole lot of public support. It was weak due to inflation and the failing economy. China was not in a good economic place in 1945. Public support for Mao. Remember, his supporters were peasants, were farmers, and he got a lot of support from those folks because he promised them land reform. Military organization. We have ineffective, corrupt leadership, poor morale in the Nationalist Party, and then over on the other side, you have a very experienced, motivated type of guerrilla type of army, all right? Ones that just came from the farms. They were just, put down their rakes and their farm tools and picked up a gun, and they went to fight for the Communist Party under Mao, all right? Now, in 1927, this is where what we're getting into now is we're going to be talking a little bit about the Chinese Civil War, okay, during the interwar period from 1927 up to about World War II, all right? The Nationalist Party chases the Communist Party out of the cities, all right? And this is where the Communist Party gets their support, begins to see their support come from the communist or from the peasants of China. And this is where Mao goes on his long march from 1934 to 1935. You can see the route that he takes, all the way through China there. And then you also can see where Japan begins to conquest areas of China, those areas of, green or yellow, whatever colors they are. I know, I'm colorblind. So that's where the Japanese had control. And then you see the communist base areas before 1934. So you don't see a whole lot of communist support before 1934 in China. Now, they begin to get a lot of support from the peasants, like I said, and that's one thing, I know I've said it like several times over, but that is very, very important to understand because, it's very comparable to what happens in the Soviet Union. They get support from the workers. They get support from those that are not of the elite class. Now, the one thing that differs between the Chinese Communist Party under the leadership of Mao and the Soviet Communist Party under the leadership of Lenin is in their leaders. Yes, they are both communists, but you have to remember that Mao comes from a peasant type of family, a background. He was a pig farmer, where Lenin on the other side was educated. He was part of the bourgeoisie class in the Soviet Union or in Russia before it became the Soviet Union. So where these two political leaders come from are very, very different, but they gain support from the same types of people. In Russia, they gain support from the working class, the factory people, where in China, they gain support from the peasants. So during the war, they used guerrilla warfare tactics against the Nationalist Party. They begin to experiment with land reform under communist areas of control, and they also look for efforts to empower women. So you see a lot of new things going on under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. Just hang on here for a second. There we go. All right. So we have this civil war that's going on between the CCP and the Nationalist Party. But then we have Japan invades. And, we all know about, the invasion or the rape of Nanking. We saw, a video on that and the stories that came out of that. And I'm not going to go into detail about that at all. But during this time period of Japan coming in to invade China, you see this stopping of the civil war between the CCP and the Nationalist Party, and they team up to fight the enemy, to fight the Japanese, because they understand that we cannot let Japan take control of the nation, because if they do, then China as a country under its own leadership will not exist. And, the Nationalist Party did lose a lot of land. They lost control over most of China due to this invasion, and they were forced to retreat inland. The Nationalist Party seemed more concerned at this time about controlling China than getting rid of the Japanese at this time. And of course, when they have that sort of mentality about them, the common people, the peasants, are going, well, wait a minute. Why aren't you concerned with fighting off this invader as opposed to being more concerned with just your control of the country? All right, so Japanese have always been a threat to Japan since the late 19th century. After Japan becomes industrialized, they are constantly threatening China at this time. Then 1937, Japan invades, and they take control of the northern areas along the coast, as you see by this map here. And then, of course, we get the rape of Nanking. And then this is periods where the Chinese Communist Party and the Nationalist Party are united to fight against the Japanese. And they also received a lot of American aid during this time to fight the Japanese, because after 1941, the United States was in full war against the Japanese as well. So after World War II begins, of course, our interest in China increases after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, and then at a conference in Cairo in 1943, you get Lenin, or you don't get Lenin, sorry, you get FDR, you get Churchill, and you also get Chiang Kai-shek, and they discuss the war efforts. As you see, Mao was not a part of that picture. Mao was not invited to this conference, even though that he was fighting, the ideas of Chiang Kai-shek. Of course, the United States and Great Britain didn't want to have anything to do with communism at this time, and the Westerners at this time, at this conference, gave up their imperialist rights in China. This is when those spheres of influence, especially from the Westerners in Europe and the United States, go away in China. Okay. And then by 1949, the war has ended. Of course, World War II ended in 1945, and the Civil War resumes in China at the time. But communists gain control. Mao gains control in 1949. The one thing that happens to Chiang Kai-shek is that his government wastes a lot of national aid. Remember, their government was considered corrupt. And then by 1949, Chiang Kai-shek has to retreat to the island of Taiwan, or Formosa at the time. Okay, so the Chinese Communist Party. They are called the People's Liberation Army. This is a photo of them in the late 1940s. They fought very vigorously against the Japanese. They offered security to many Chinese that faced Japanese atrocities. And from 1937, the Chinese Communist Party membership grew from 40,000 to 1.2 million in 1945. So you see this exponential growth in Chinese Party membership because of what Mao represented, and the types of people that he wanted in his party. The Chinese Communist Party gains more support because of the things that they do. It isn't just because they beat the Japanese or they really helped with the Japanese, fighting against the Japanese. They reduce rents, taxes, and interest rates for peasants. They reduce all of that. They taught literacy. They tried to educate the adults. They mobilize women. Women become very, very important. Mao's wife is very outspoken about politics here. And they encourage peasants to fight back against their landowners. So you see a lot of focus on the lower classes here in China because of the Chinese Communist Party. So just a real quick recap here of the Civil War in China is that between 1927 and 1932 and 1933 and 1937, you see this war between the Communists and the Nationalists. The Communists under control of Mao, you have the Nationalists under the control of Chiang Kai-shek. We do see periods of this Civil War where they stop completely down to fight the Japanese, and by 1949, the Communists are victorious, and the Nationalists retreat to Formosa, or which is present-day Taiwan. And basically, it ends imperialism in China here. Hong Kong, which we have discussed in Class 2, was returned to China in 1997. That was a part of that Treaty of Nanking, that unequal treaty that the British set up with the Chinese after the First Opium War, that they gained control of Hong Kong, and part of that treaty was that it would be returned back to China in 1997. So, honestly, that wasn't too long ago. So some geographical changes here. The Communists gained control over most of what we see as present-day China. Now it says territories controlled by the People's Republic of China, that is the Communist Party, and territorial controls by the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek is just the little island of Taiwan there. So that is where Chiang Kai-shek ran after the Communists ran or took control in 1949. Let's skip over that. All right. So some political changes under Mao. All right. So we see this wholesale change of what politics are all about under Mao. He will lead this country until his death in 1946. So from 1949 to 1976, from 1949 to 1976. So, he is leading this country for approximately, 26 years. So we see this big change. Economic changes under Mao. These are pretty significant. And much like Stalin and, Lenin early on in the Soviet Union, they tried to implement these 5-year plans to industrialize, to collectivize agriculture, build the electrical infrastructure, iron plants and iron factories, and steel production increases. This is a 5-year plan, moving people to certain places of the country to live near factories, to work in factories, and then collectivize land under government control to better feed the people. And then we have the second 5-year plan between 1958 and 1962, and this is probably the most significant one because this is what is called the Great Leap Forward. All right, this is one of these ideas that Mao institutes to really push his country forward economically, agriculturally, industrially here. And it wants to become a leading industrial country. All right, peasants are organized into into communes here where they are forced off their land and they are put into these areas. Hang on here, my PowerPoint just went down on my phone. And they are forced into these areas where they live together, and they try to grow crops to better feed their community. But much like what happens in the Soviet Union under Stalin, we see large amounts of famine. It doesn't work out too well. You see a lot of corruption. You see a lot of widespread catastrophe leading to millions of deaths in China because people are not getting fed. People that are growing the food are lying and saying, hey, we've got enough food here to feed people, and in reality they do not, because they don't want to upset Mao. So they lie, they falsify the records to make it seem better than it is. So we have this huge widespread famine going on in China under this what was called the Great Leap Forward, and many will say it was actually a great leap backwards for China at this time. So foreign relations in China, you get this growing split between the Soviet Union and China. They do have a peaceful coexistence, but they differ on how communism should be used to lead the people. In the early 1950s, you have Stalinism in the Soviet Union, and we all know about Stalin and his terrible policies and pogroms against his people, and it's very totalitarianistic, where in China it might be a little bit more towards what Karl Marx was talking about, what communism should be. And the Soviets wanted to have a huge hand in China, but by 1960 the Chinese are saying, no, let's end the Soviet economic aid, let's do it on ourselves, or do it for ourselves. Areas where China begins to enforce their influence in places like Tibet. They seized that in 1962. Korea, they aid North Korea in the Korean War against the United Nations troops, which include the United States between 1950 and 1953. And Vietnam, of course, they support North Vietnam and aided the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War between 1959 and 1975. And again, these two areas of Korea and Vietnam, all right, we talked about the Cold War. And the Cold War was this long time period where you have ideologies constantly at battle with each other. The Soviet Union and communism versus the United States and democracy and capitalism, and those things were constantly fighting. And we have this big military arms buildup in nuclear weapons, and we're trying to keep the world at peace through what we call nuclear diplomacy. So we don't see this huge war break out between the United States and the Soviet Union, but we do see smaller wars break out, and the two big ones here that we tend to talk about are Korea and Vietnam. North Korea supported by Communist China, South Korea supported by Democratic United States. And again, 1950 to 1953, it's a 3-year conflict. And we're still in a truce. That war has technically not come to an end yet. That's why we still have a demilitarized zone in Korea between North and South. In Vietnam, the same thing happens. North Vietnam is supported by Communist China, and Southern Vietnam is supported by the United States. So here you have communism versus capitalism and democracy, and it breaks out in these little places like Korea and Vietnam. And again, it's all a part of the Truman policy. Contain communism where it is. Do not let it spread. That is why the United States gets involved with that. So during the Cold War, you see these littler wars break out. And Korea and Vietnam are perfect places. Then in 1980s, you see the Afghan War, where the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, to spread communism, and the United States supports the Afghan rebels to fight against communism. We give them arms, we give them money, we give them military advisors to fight communism from spreading. That's where Osama bin Laden gets his training. So Osama bin Laden gets his training from the American CIA and the American military to fight the communists. And then, of course, the money, the weapons that we give, Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen, that's what they were called during that time, kind of comes back and bites us, of course, with 9/11 and Osama bin Laden there. So foreign relations is always a communism versus democracy type of thing for China very early on. Foreign relations here, let me see here. Okay. So you have the Cold War going on in the world context. 1964, China explodes their first atomic weapon. They become part of what is called the Atomic Club at this time. They are the fifth overall country to explode an atomic bomb. They are the first non-white country to do this. The United Nations, they become part of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council in 1971. Their relations with the United States tends to get a little bit better here. 1972, this bottom right-hand picture here shows President Nixon opening up relations, opening up talks with China, because Nixon understands the economic importance of what China will be in the future. All right, during 1966 and 1969, we have this thing called the Cultural Revolution in China. All right, it's an effort to revive interest in Mao's ideas. Mao kind of lost a lot of support between 1949 and 1966, and the reason he loses a lot of support is because of the famine and things that are like that are going on, the catastrophes that are going on in China. They really don't push themselves forward as much as some people wanted to, and Mao had lost a lot of support, but he was still the leader of the country, and he comes up with this idea called the Cultural Revolution, and it is basically to promote his ideas. And in these pictures, you can see these Chinese workers, these Chinese young men here holding up this thing. It's called the Little Red Book. And what the Little Red Book was, is it was the idea to spread his way of life. It was full of Mao quotations, and you had to know it front and back if you were a part of this elite cultural revolution. All right. Mao during this time also says, we're having a lot of problems with our country. And he promotes this program called the Blooming of 1,000 Flowers, I believe. And he told his country, he says, hey, I want new ideas. What do you have for me that can help our country? And what this does, it allows Mao to find out who his opponents are, because a lot of people started coming out of the woodwork, scholars, teachers, other politicians say we need to do this and this and this and this. And of course, they weren't what Mao wanted to do. And once Mao was able to find these people, he would arrest them, he would execute them, he would make them go away. So again, that was all a part of the Cultural Revolution. He says that the bourgeoisie were trying to take the party away from him, away from the people that got him where he was. So he calls on the youth to engage in this post-revolutionary class revolt. And the youth were supposed to, rat out their teachers if their teachers were saying things against Mao and the Communist Party. If your parents were talking bad against Mao, you were supposed to tell on them, rat them out. And if you did that, you were seen as a good communist, possibly a communist leader. And if your parents were talking bad about Mao or the party itself, they were made to disappear. They were put in jail, and if it was bad enough, they were probably executed as well. So you have this huge turnaround in China under this Cultural Revolution between 1966 and 1969. And again, you see, like under Stalin, you see a lot of people disappear for a variety of reasons, just because they may have spoke out against the government or against Mao. All right, so Mao dies in September of 1976. All right, and you get a group of people that tried to take over China in 1976. It's called the Gang of Four, and they fail to do this. And China is under the leadership of a gentleman called Dao Xiaoping. Don't worry so much about his name, but the one thing after the death of Mao that you have to keep in mind is that they continued to industrialize. All right, that is more important to China at this point. They begin to turn to some Western economic ideas. More capitalist elements begin to be implemented after Mao passes away in 1976. You get the one-child policy adopted. They understand that their country is beginning to grow exponentially, and they need to gain control of that. Also, you have things like Tiananmen Square happen in China at this point. During the late 1980s, early 1990s, you see a lot of pro-Western demonstrations going on, as you see in that latter part or that lower picture there. And then, of course, the Chinese are known for letting the ideas get out there, like these pro-democracy movements. But then when it gets too far for the Chinese, when it gets to become a huge problem, they will yank that chain back pretty hard. And they do that with Tiananmen Square, as you see with Tank Man there up in the upper left-hand corner, where they bring in the troops to disperse this pro-democracy movement. And of course, we all know that China is still not a democratic country, and for all intents and purposes, it won't be for a very, very long time. All right, so let's take a look at this. Things you need to consider after this lecture is: which group led the Republican Revolution of 1912? These are just questions to consider. What common enemy united the Nationalists and the Communists? And of course, that was the Japanese in World War II. Who led the Communist Revolution? That, of course, would be Mao. I would really take a look at in your book where it describes the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. I really think you should take a look at those two areas of Chinese history, because those are something that might be brought up in an essay of some sort. Here were governments trying to fix problems that they were having in their country, and they looked at the Great Leap Forward as a possible fix. That is the industrialization, that is the collectivization, and then how do we fix the politics of the nation, and that is the Cultural Revolution. And again, what issues does China face today? You're looking at getting control of their population. How many Western ideas can you implement into a communist nation? Those are some of the issues that they are facing. So, well, I hope you guys got a lot out of this. I will continue to do this from time to time during this quarantine era of your school year. Hopefully we will get back together soon face to face. I can't promise you anything or when that will be, but I hope you continue to tune in to these types of things, take notes over this type of thing that we've talked about, because this will be part of binder checks when we do return to school. And and if we don't return to school, we'll figure that out as we go. I really don't know. And as soon as I know something about College Board and the AP exam, and if that is going to stay the same as of right now, it is still scheduled to be when it is. I have no control over that. Our district has no control over that. That is totally up to College Board. So they will make that determination. And as soon as I hear something, I will make sure I'll pass it along to you. So if you have any questions at all concerning this, I know maybe the sound wasn't great, but I can't do much about that because I'm using this web-based program. Please ask. Send me a message through Remind, send me an email. I'm trying to stay on top of that. So be watching for another lecture coming up. It'll probably be over decolonization after World War II. What happens to those areas that decolonize, that self-determine? We need to take a look at that. And don't slack off on your reading and your notes. That is something that is very, very important. Even though you may not want to do it, you'd rather sit there and watch YouTube or Netflix or whatever your method of video watching is. Take some time for your classes, because you still will be responsible for some things. All right, guys, well, you take care. Remember, get sleep, stay inside, wash your hands, do all the things necessary, social distance from people, and you know what? It won't be too long before we're all back together. All right, peace out, guys.